Okay, this is section 4.1 in grade 8 math, talking about fractions, decimals, and percents. And given one of them, either a fraction, decimal, or percent, being able to write the other two when given one. So the first question gives you 1 over 1,000, and it asks you to write that as a decimal and a percent. Well, in order for us to read a fraction properly, we have to think about place value. And the place value system is written in tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, etc. That's called the base 10 system. And when a fraction has one of those numbers as a denominator, that allows you to read the numerator and place it into that place value. So when I read this fraction, I want to read this as 1,000th, which means this is the tenths, this is the hundredths, this is the thousandths. Whatever that numerator was that I put, I'm going to put it in that position and end it in that position. In this case, it's a 1. If it had been a 12, I would have put 12 in the hundredth. Like if it had been this question, that's how I would write it, right? But for this case, it's 1,000th, so that goes there, and the other two become 0. So the answer is 0.001 as a decimal. Now, as a percentage, all I have to do is take my original fraction, whatever it happened to be, and I have to convert it into an equivalent fraction out of 100. Because percents, again, are French from per means, I think, of, and cent means, I think, 100. I don't know, I don't speak French very well, but I think it literally translates into of 100. So if you take any fraction and convert it into an equivalent fraction out of 100, you'll know the percentage. In this case, divide both by 10. When I divide 1 by 10, I take the decimal that's there, and I move it one spot over. So I'd have that as an equivalent fraction, which means it is 0.1%. Okay, less than 1%. In the second question, we have 1.02. That's the decimal given. So I can't read it as 1.02, otherwise I'll never be able to write it as a fraction. But if I read it as 1, well, that's not the right number. 1, and, the decimal can be written as and, 2 hundredths. If I read it that way, then I will be able to translate it to a fraction. So 1 and 2 hundredths looks like this. Okay? And if I want to write that in lowest terms, I can put or 1 and 1/50th. They're both the same fraction. Okay? So that's how you would write it as a fraction. And if I think about 1 and 2 hundredths, because it's a mixed fraction, I can't write it as a percentage easily. So what I want to do is I want to rethink that fraction as an improper fraction. In this case, it would be 102 hundredths. And if I have 102 hundredths, I know I have 102%. I had better than 100%, 102%. And in the last question, you have 0.75%. When you have a fractional percent, oh, actually, going back to the first question, you had 1/10 of a percent as your answer. That is correct. Another way to write this answer would have been to write it as 1/10 of a percent. So both of these two answers in the first question are the same, right? And in this third question, 0.75%, that's the same thing as this one. These two answers here are the same thing. And it's important that you see them as the same thing, because sometimes people look at 0.75% and they think of it as being 75%, but it's actually less than 1%. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to a fraction. Okay, so I'm going to go way over here and change it as a fraction. And I can't use this one to change it to a fraction because percents, this would look like this. If I didn't change it to a decimal, it would look like this, which is incredibly confusing looking. But the better way to look at it is like this. So given the two choices between the fraction percentage and the regular decimal percentage, since both of them are out of 100, I'm going to choose this method to write it. And once I have it that way, I just have to acknowledge the fact that a decimal can't really appear in a numerator of a fraction. So in order to get rid of it, I have to multiply both by whatever base 10 number is enough to get rid of it. So I have to move it 2 places, which means I want to multiply it by 100. I'll have 10,000 as my denominator, and I'll have 75 as my numerator. So the answer to the question, what is 0.75% as a fraction? The answer is 75 10,000ths. I'll just erase that. And in lowest terms, since both are divisible by 25. I'd have 3 over 400. Is that right? I think so. 3 over 400 in lowest terms. And finally, as a decimal, if I take this one, since my denominator is that perfect base 10 system denominator, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, I can read this as being 75 10,000ths. And I could write it as tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. There's my 10,000ths. So 75 has to end there. Put my zeros in place, and I have 0.0075.